Fox Valley Catholic Bible Study Group. Glad to see all of you. Some faces we didn't see last week. Welcome. Welcome back. A few new ones. Welcome again. Let us begin with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, make a saint of me. Show me how to rid myself of traits of character that annoy others, that make the lives of those about me miserable. Help me to break the hardened shell within which selfishness hides and which renders me insensible to the needs of others. May I become great enough to be the servant of both rich and poor. May I grow strong in virtue, so as to sustain the weak and encourage the weary. May my heart increase its power to love, so as to be able to minister kindness to the timid and mercy to the wayward. And may I have the honor to bring cheer to all my fellow men and women on the long and sometimes rugged road of life today. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So, we're looking in the book of Maccabees, and you will find on your tables a new handout, and up in the left-hand corner is kind of a chart of the family of the Maccabees and a beautiful colored map. And this is just to help us, maybe not so much today, but next week, in the next couple weeks, as we look at the individual members of the Maccabean family. And look at some of the ins and outs. Today I'd like to place it kind of in the historical broader historical context. You see, the book of Maccabees can be called intertestamental books. In other words, they kind of, in a historical sense, they fall between what we call the Old Testament and New Testament. Testament, of course, means covenant. And actually, the second book of Maccabees deals more with the piety, the religious interpretation of many of the events that are found in the first book, which seems to be a little more historical. The broader historical context, I tried to put a little chart up here. These events that we find in these books fall into the era where there's the beginning of the rise of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the fall of the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire is actually the remnants of Alexander's, the Great Empire. And we mentioned, just to keep a touch point, Alexander the Great dies in 323. Okay, so his great empire, which basically stretched across part of North Africa, all of the Middle East, and then further east as far as the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains. So what we call today the countries of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, almost not quite Pakistan, but India, southern parts of Russia, all those states that you look on the map where Stan went through. Kazakhstan, Stanistan. You know, they're all named with Stan at the end of, you know, all the, in southern Russia. So, and it was like a blitzkrieg within, you know, 10, 15 years. He did that. And then he dies at an early age, 30-some, early 30s, Alexander the Great, and then that empire becomes split between his generals. And we mentioned last week that to the west, centered around Egypt, was the Ptolemies, and to the east, let's use Syria as a point, that was the Seleucids. Okay? And much of the history is here in Maccabees. Will focus on those who became kings from the Seleucid standpoint, although there's a little bit about the Ptolemy as well, the Ptolemies. I also said this was during the time period of the beginning of the rise of the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire wasn't an empire yet. So, during this time period, probably between 300 and 200, the Romans were engaged in what's called the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars, which meant they were fighting against the armies coming out of Carthage in North Africa. And you probably remember from your social studies. How many years ago, Todd?
Over 50.
No, it was the last millennium.
That sounds worse.
That sounds worse. So, Hannibal with his elephants coming in and invading Italy from the north. You remember that? Well, that was part of the Punic Wars. Okay? And Hannibal comes into play here just a little bit, although he's not mentioned in these books as such. But during this time period, the Jews are in basically Palestine, what we call Israel today. But there was also a very large population of Jews in Egypt, and especially in what became the great capital for the Ptolemy kings, Alexandria. And they were building the great library and other things in Alexandria at that time. Ptolemy II, nicknamed Philadelphus, who reigned in Egypt from 285 to 246 BC, he was the one that kind of commissioned, or his librarian to the new library, wanted a copy in Greek of the Hebrew Scriptures. And of course that became the Septuagint, right? And the legend with the 70 scholars writing it in different places and coming together and bringing it together and so on. Now, actually, it's in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verses 5 through 45, that gives us a partial list, not a total comprehensive list, but a partial list of all the generals who succeeded Alexander the Great. Daniel, chapter 11. If you want to look it up, you can. Okay. But he names them kind of in veiled language. So basically, between 300 and 200, what we have is these, one declining empire, one growing empire, and Palestine is kind of caught in the middle. And for a time period, they're not affected too much. Under the Ptolemies, the Jews, particularly in Palestine, the Ptolemy kings allowed them to practice their own religion and take care of their own business and, have their own religious piety and so on. And don't forget, there was a big group of Jews in Egypt and Alexandria as well as in Israel. Things began to change around 200 BC. The Seleucid king Antiochus, around 200. The Greek king Antiochus the third fought against the Ptolemy armies and defeated them at a place called Panias. Which basically is at the foothills of Mount Hermon. And it would be located, here's Damascus, it's north of the Sea of Galilee, and back in ancient times they had another little Lake Hula, so it's north of there. The highest mountain peak in the Middle East is Mount Hermon, mentioned in the Psalms and everything, okay, over 10,000 feet high. Usually snow-capped year-round, even today, okay? So right at the foothills, or right at the foot of that, there was this great battle between these, the generals, Greek generals, okay? Incidentally, why would they fight at a place like that? Because the melting snows on Mount Hermon provide the fresh water for the beginning of the Jordan River. And it enters into the north end of the Sea of Galilee and out the south end of the Sea of Galilee and goes all the way down, providing the eastern border to Israel, between Israel and Syria. So that was significant. Now, Antiochus III was kind of favorable to the Jews, particularly the Jews in Judea. He gave them money to repair the damages that were done in their cities with his war against the Ptolemies. That was cool, huh? He allowed them to be tax-free. And that's always a good thing, isn't it? Now, however, Rome was the rising part. And shortly after that, Antiochus, his dream was to unify all the different districts of what was Alexander's empire. So he wanted to move into Macedonia, southern Greece, and get that. However, he was blocked by the Romans. And in what is called the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, Antiochus III, his army was defeated by a Roman army. And Antiochus, actually, it was kind of surprising because one of the generals in Antiochus' army was Hannibal. Old Hannibal. And he had, all these elephants and all these other mercenaries from further east, but he was still defeated by the Romans. And they made a treaty. And part of the treaty with the Romans was that the Greeks had to pay an annual indemnity. All right? An annual indemnity. And in order to make sure that Antiochus was going to pay that, they took his son, who was named after him, Antiochus, and they took him hostage back to Rome. 2 years later, about 188, 187, Antiochus dies while raiding some shrines in the east in order to pay his indemnity to the Roman Empire. He dies, and so his son, not his son named Antiochus, but the second son, Seleucus, the fourth, he comes into power. This is still Greek. So Seleucus, the fourth. Now, from 187 to 175, Seleucus the fourth ruled the area that's Palestine. He's in the second book of the Maccabees. He's called the King of Asia, but he runs into the same problem that his dad did, finding enough money to pay the indemnity to Rome. And kind of interesting summary. Let's turn to 2 Maccabees chapter 3. 2 Maccabees chapter 3. Now, one of the things about 2 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees is all about, over and over again, protecting the temple and the shrine in Jerusalem and Orthodox Jewish piety and festivals and so on. The whole book is about that. It looks at some of the same history as First Maccabees, but it does so through the religious eyes. Okay, so here, chapter 3, 2 Maccabees. While the holy city lived in perfect peace and the laws were strictly observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias and his hatred of evil, the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple with most magnificent gifts. Thus, Seleucus, that's the one I'm telling you about, the fourth, king of Asia, defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses necessary for sacrificial services. And then it goes into a certain Simon and kind of an interfraternal war, basically over the high priesthood in Jerusalem. So the king Seleucus sends that Heliodorus as his minister. Look at verse 7. When Apollonius had an audience with the king, he informed him about the riches that had been reported to him, the riches in the temple in Jerusalem. What did they say about the temple in Jerusalem? Look at verse 6. It was reported to them, the treasury in Jerusalem was so full of untold riches that the total sum of money was incalculable and out of all proportion to the cost of the sacrifices, and that it would be possible to bring it all under control of the king of Asia, Seleucus. The temple treasury in Jerusalem was loaded. Okay? And even later on into the first century, the Romans would come and, try to borrow money, especially when King Herod the Great was in charge, borrow money from the treasury. You can read through, this account. It's kind of a fascinating account. But this Heliodorus, who is presented here as a chancellor of the king of Asia, Seleucus, he's a bad man. He's a bad, bad man. Okay? So he comes, and he uses diplomacy to talk nice to the high priest, and can we borrow, can we get some of the money out of the temple treasury? And the high priest said, no. Okay, then we're just going to take it. So he sends in some Greek soldiers to take the money and some of the for the offerings. And you can read the rest of this. There's a whole section, verses 22 to 40. Divine intervention. The Greek soldiers are prevented from entering the temple by, all of a sudden it gets into science fiction almost. Far more powerful soldiers than them. And Heliodorus had to go back to the king without the money. Let's fast forward down to verse 37 in chapter 3. When the king asked Heliodorus who would be a suitable man to be sent to Jerusalem next, he answered, if you have an enemy or a plotter against the government, send him there, and you will receive him back well flogged, if indeed he survives at all. For there is certainly some special divine power about that place. He who has his dwelling in heaven watches over that place and protects it, and he strikes down and destroys those who come to harm it. And this is how the matter concerning Heliodorus and the preservation of the treasury turned out. Now, by that last line, Heliodorus is a historical figure. Okay, this whole divine intervention. If you read through that part, like I said, it's kind of like a sci-fi kind of movie kind of thing. The other historical thing is this Heliodorus ends up assassinating Seleucus IV, killing the king, and of course the other son who was held as a hostage in Rome, Antiochus IV, comes into play. And I mentioned him last week. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was his nickname. Epiphanes, actually, Epiphanes. This nickname means God's beneficent or manifest, because he thought himself not as the son of Antiochus III, but like a divine son of God. He had a big head, in other words. Okay? And he's the one who's going to inflict the kind of the background to what will become the rise of the revolt of the Maccabees. So let's flip back to first Maccabees. Okay? And so first Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 10. there sprang from these sinful offshoots Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, once a hostage in Rome. He became king in the year 137. That's not our reckoning. He became king, not in that, but in around 175 BC, as we reckon history. So, in those days he appeared in Israel, men who were breaking the law, and they reduced many people, saying, let us go and make an alliance with the Gentiles all around us, since we separated from them, many evils can come upon us. So the proposal was agreed. Some from among the people came to introduce the way of living of the Gentiles in Jerusalem. So what did they do? They built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom. And they covered over the mark of their circumcisions and abandoned the Holy Covenant, and they allied themselves with the Gentiles and sold themselves into wrongdoing. Now, let's face it, in our day and age, you can't build a school without building a gymnasium, right? Huh?
Right.
Yeah, every school has to have a gymnasium.
What chapter are you, Father?
Chapter
Of the first Maccabees, 5 or?
Chapter 1.
1.
I'm way ahead of you. Okay.
Oh, you're way behind. Okay.
Depends on what day I got up.
Yeah. We all feel that way sometimes, right? So, but what you have to understand, gymnasium yes, it was for athletic pursuits, but also training in military skills, and also intellectual, which meant Greek philosophy, huh? There's a footnote here in the New American Bible. Gymnasium is a symbol and center of athletic and intellectual life. It was the chief instrument of Hellenistic propaganda. Jewish youth were attracted by sports. Go figure. Just like today, right? And encouraged to join youth clubs. So the Greeks had youth ministry way before we thought of it, huh? They received training in military skills and in the duties of citizenship, Greek statesmanship. Through participation in intellectual life, many were gradually won over to paganism. So the gymnasium became an instrument for indoctrinating youth in Hellenism. In other words, Greek culture. And not just any youth here, we're saying this was built in Jerusalem, so it's influencing a young generation of Jewish people, okay? Jewish youth. Furthermore, this Antiochus imposed restrictions on the Jews. He forbade, later on it'll indicate, he forbade them to have scrolls of the book of the law. He forbade the women from circumcising their children. And the most horrifying thing from the Jewish standpoint was that he he put into the temple what was called the abomination of desolation. So, chapter 1, look at verse 54. Seems like we're jumping around, but they don't follow in chronological order anyhow. So, the king, second half of that verse, the king erected the horrible abomination, you might have abomination of desolation, upon the altar of Holocaust, and in the surrounding cities of Judah they built pagan altars. They also burnt incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. Any scrolls of the law which they found they tore up and burned. Whoever was found with the scroll of the covenant and whoever observed the law was condemned to death by royal decree. And so they used their power against Israel, against those who were caught, each month in the cities. On the 25th day of each month, they sacrificed on the altar and erected over the altar holocaust. And let me just interject here. They did not offer sheep or lambs or goats. What do you think the Greeks offered?
Pork.
They had pig roast.
Okay.
Pig. And of course, you know, the prohibition of the Jews not eating pig and so on. Huh? And so this was on the altar of sacrifice in front of the Jewish temple. They put this temple to probably Zeus Olympus, and they were offering holocaust, probably swine. But that's not all. Look at verse 60. Women who had their children circumcised were put to death, in keeping with the decree, with the babies hung from their necks. And their families also, and those who had circumcised them were killed. But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean. You know what they're talking about there. No bacon or ham. No pork chops for the Jews. And they preferred to die rather than to be defiled with unclean food or profane the Holy Covenant. And they did die. Terrible affliction was upon Israel during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So it's a bad time, huh? Now, so Epiphanes, he takes over in 175. All right? He gets this grand idea, probably because he was held as a hostage in Rome for X amount of years, and he heard stories, and he probably gleaned something about the Roman armies and how they fought and so on. So he all of a sudden he wanted to fulfill what was actually his father Antiochus III's great desire, was to reunify the empire of Alexander the Great. His father wanted that, but he was defeated by the Romans and had to sign that peace treaty. Antiochus said, okay, I'm not going to butt up against the Romans. I'm going to take over Egypt and the Ptolemies, under the Ptolemies. So he started advancing his armies towards Egypt. Rome heard about it. And Rome said to him, hey, you pipsqueak, you Greek pipsqueak. You leave Egypt alone. Get back where you belong. Go back east. Well, they scared them. They scared him, and was, he was beaten like a dog by Rome. Not with war, but, with threat. And so as he was going back east to Syria, Damascus, probably Babylon, he took a little side trip up into the hill country of Judea to Jerusalem. Why? Where was the money?
In the temple.
In the temple treasury, to reload. And to put up this abomination of desolation. Well, that wasn't going to, and he left behind all kinds of strong prescriptions, what we just read, the summary of, to inflict on the Jewish people. So that didn't sit very well. Now, we must say, there was a sizable population of Jewish people, and a lot of the young ones being trained. They liked going to the gym. Just like millennials today, huh? They like going to the gym, get this athletic training, military training, intellectual training, becoming Hellenized, right? But, and we find this a lot of times in a lot of cultures, especially cultures that basically are ruled, have a overlay of a certain religion, okay? And, it might be either very strong and orthodox in the cities or very weak, in this case, in Jerusalem, the weakening of the Jewish, impact of the Jewish religion in Jerusalem, where the temple is. But out in the countryside, the countryside people may very well still hold to an orthodoxy. And that was the case here. And so, the other thing I just want to point out, Antiochus is stopped cold by Roman threat. So here again, around 170, we get a clash between the Roman Empire and the weakening Greek Empire. And with Antiochus IV and trying to inflict Hellenism on the Jewish population, he picks on the little guys. And it sets the stage for the Maccabean revolt. All right? So, you follow me so far?
Yes.
Does it make sense? No?
Yes.
Just for some people, I hope.
Well, yeah, there's a lot what you're talking about. There's an awful lot that goes into Matthias Maccabee and his zeal for what he has done and the violence that he raises against the conquerors.
Exactly. You're summing it up, Roy, just very well. This is the big background story to what will emerge as the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks and Matthias. All right. Any other insights or comments? Yeah, Tom.
I take it you're using a loose translation, not word for word?
A loose translation, yes. Then what?
You're using a loose translation, not word for word,
Yes.
right?
A loose translation and not word for word. Basically, I work off a solid translation. New American Bible. Okay. Now, Let's take a look at the leadership of Matthias. So we go into chapter 2. Chapter 2 of First Maccabees. In those days, Matthias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Joarim, left Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He and his 5 sons, John, Simon, he gave nicknames, Judas, who is called Maccabees, after which this book is identified, Eleazar, and Jonathan, who is called Apphus, the first App, yeah. When he saw the sacrileges that had been committed in Judea and in Jerusalem, and then it goes into a little speech, and he begins to lament. But he's in this little country village. It's not on here. Let's see. Is it on your map?
Yes,
Yeah,
it
it
is.
is. Bodhi. See that? So
Way to the west.
to the west, it's out in the foothills basically, heading towards the Mediterranean Sea. From Jerusalem, heading towards the Mediterranean Sea, heading towards Joppa. And of course, on biblical maps, when you see Joppa on the seacoast of the Mediterranean Sea, today that's Tel Aviv. That's where Tel Aviv is. So this is out in the countryside. So some of the Greek kingsmen, friends of the king, come, and they want to set up these little Greek shrines and altars in these little villages. Matthias, he answers in no uncertain terms. And most of this chapter is about that. I'm going to skip down. Verse 27. This gives you his insight. When Matthias went through the city and shouted, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands by the covenant follow after me." Thereupon he fled to the mountains with his sons, leaving behind his city and all his possessions. And many sought to live according to righteousness and the religious custom, went out to the desert to settle there, they and their sons and their wives and their cattle, because misfortunes pressed so hard upon them. So what caused him to flee that city? Well, before that, he gave a speech before the king's men who were trying to set up the shrine and altar. And verse 23, as he finished saying these words, the speech in front of the whole crowd of the city, a certain Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's order. And when Matthias saw him, he was filled with zeal. His heart was moved, and his just fury was aroused, and he sprang forward and killed him upon the altar. And at that time he also killed the messenger of the king, who was forcing him to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he showed his zeal for the law. So, very dramatic event. Killed his own kinsman, Jewish kinsman, who was ready to offer the sacrifice. Later on, verse 39, when Matthias and his friends heard of this, they mourned deeply. Another death. And we will all do as our kinsmen have done, they said to one another, and do not fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our traditions. They will soon destroy us from the earth. On that day they came to a decision. Verse 41, let us fight against anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath, so that we may not all die, as our kinsmen died in the hiding place. And then they were joined by a group of Hasidim, valiant Israelites, all of them devout followers of the law, And all of those who were fleeing from the disaster joined them and supported them. They gathered an army and struck down sinners in their anger and lawbreakers in their wrath, and the survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. So, filled with this righteous indignation against those fellow Jews who were becoming so Hellenized that they were practicing the religious practices, offering, setting up pagan altars and shrines, even in their villages, and offering that, Matthias started this revolt. He started the revolt. Now, he has 5 sons.
Father, question.
Yeah.
The group that joined Matthias, were they more pious Jews, or would we consider them today, what I'm trying to think of the word, the Jews in New York still wearing the yarmulke and everything? Were
Well,
they
they're called Hasidim.
Hasid? That's what. Okay.
Yeah, and here's a possible introduction to them. Here we find it, and we're talking about like 160 years before Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. And some believe that Jesus wore the side locks and everything. Yeah.
When I see the word zealous, and I think of at Jesus' time and crucifixion, there were zealots against the Roman Empire. Was that the same mindset, the zealots of Jesus' time and the zealous behavior here?
Good question. Thanks, Phil. So, zealot in Jesus' time, in the 1st century AD. No. Here, when we see zealous for the law, that is used like an adjective, okay? It's the kind of piety that they had. They were, just they're holding strong to the law and so on. The zealots at the time of Jesus, or those who were, supposedly it was springing from their piety, but they ended up being identified with a group of basically assassins that carried on guerrilla warfare against the Romans, against the Roman occupation at that time. Now, it's interesting that just a couple of decades before Jesus came on the scene, there was a strong group of zealots and a zealot movement against the Romans, and they hid out in the cliffs overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And the Romans destroyed them by having some of their soldiers rappel down the top part of the cliff and burn them out. And it said that they burned out about 1,500 lives of the zealots, and the Romans thought that they had them wiped out. Now what's interesting is a few decades later, in the same region, on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, like right below those cliffs, comes Jesus. Not Dead Sea Scrolls, no, comes Jesus and his ministry and so on. Okay. But the zealots and in the 1st century, they were almost seen like a separate religious party. You had Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and Essenes, the 4 major religious parties. And they carried out basically guerrilla tactics. So when there was a big gathering of Jews, like their high holidays and so on, the Romans were put especially on guard against these like zealots. The Romans called them Zacharii, and that was actually a description of the weapons that they used, which were kind of short, 2-edged, very sharp knives that they go through the crowds and come up behind the Roman soldier, take honor of the roses, stick them in the ribs and kill them, and then off they go, hide themselves in the crowd. And so the zealots of the first century. Here, zealous, it means that they wanted to be orthodox, holding to the book of the law. Okay? Now, you see a little description of Matthias after he dies of an old age, living in the Modine after this. They brought him back. And then almost right away, not his first son, but his third son begins a revolt around 166 and 160, and carries on actually a revolt against the Greek troops. And basically, it's guerrilla warfare. So the way to read this chart, and I'm sorry, it's not exactly geared to the passages, but Judas, Maccabees, and he was known as the hammer, and that's where the word Maccabee comes from, which I find kind of humorous, really. Maccabee. If you ever went to Israel, the number one beer in Israel is Maccabi. Yeah. That beer company sponsors the main basketball team, international basketball team for Israel. And so they're called, Maccabees. For the basketball team, that they're going to hammer everyone else. And if they win a game, everyone else goes out and gets hammered. Yeah. They actually produce a pretty delicious beer. That's the kind of personal experience.
Talking from experience.
I'm talking from experience. Yeah. Not the cheapest, but it's delicious. But there's an ongoing, and we'll look a little bit more about each of these guys in the passages next week. And Jonathan. Now, there's going to be gaps in here between these guys. And part of the gaps will be due to the fact that, slowly but surely, Epiphanes will be succeeded by someone else, who will be succeeded by someone else. There's assassinations, there's guys dying in wars and so on. There's a whole series of, Roman leaders back and forth. And there's if you read on your own, First Maccabees and going into Second Maccabees, what's sad is this Matthias, he starts out, so we'll use the term Phil picked up, zealous for the law and zealous for Orthodox Judaism, okay? And for the Jews to hold strong to the covenant. By the time the last son comes, those sons had gotten themselves in a position with the Greeks where they made a treaty with the Greeks, or they paid the Greeks to become high priest of the Jews, even though they were not of the tribe, because the Greeks recognized that the person who was in charge, the high priest of the temple, he was going to have the greatest influence over the Jewish food. So the Greeks offered the high priesthood to the Jewish temple to the highest bidder. And some of those sons, towards the tail end of Matthias, were going to pay for a high priesthood, with the rationale that by doing this, they can bring peace to their people and hopefully influence the orthodoxy of Judaism. Unfortunately, they became more influenced by the Hellenism of the Greeks than, so it's gonna be detrimental and kind of peter out as they achieve or gain political concessions with the Seleucid leaders. In order to preserve an independent nature to the Jewish state, they're going to be compromising the faith along the way. What about the Romans? The Roman influence? Well, there was so much going on with the Seleucid Empire and leaders back and forth, getting bumped off or dying in wars and so on, that for the Jewish people, that was a good thing, because then the Greeks and the Romans left them alone, basically from 135, 140, until the Romans took over the Palestine in 66 BC, or 63 BC. And then we entered into that pre-intertestamental period, okay? So, and there, there's not much history or recording of these events from secular sources, other than like Josephus writing at the end of the 1st century AD. So this, when you continue to read through this, Maccabees, 1st or 2nd Maccabees, realize that it's from a perspective, from Jewish, strong religious Jewish zealots, and they're reflecting on their history. They're not trying to be an objective historian about what's happening with the Greeks, but from the standpoint of their own history. So thank you very much for coming, everyone.
Holy cow. One more battle after another battle and another purification of the desolation